The auctioneer's gavel cracked through the musty air of the county courthouse like a gunshot. And just like that, Mara Whitfield became the owner of something everyone else had spent decades trying to forget. Sold. To bid on 23 for $17,000. The room erupted. Not in applause, never applause, but in that particular breed of laughter that cuts deeper than any insult. The kind that wraps itself around your ribs and squeezes until you can't breathe. Mara heard it ripple through the folding chairs behind her. Saw it in the smirks of the real estate investors who'd shown up hoping for lakefront property or commercial lots. She felt the heat crawl up her neck, blooming across her cheeks like spilled wine on linen, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward. She'd learned long ago that the only way through shame was to walk directly into its mouth and dare it to swallow you whole. "Girls out of her goddamn mind," someone muttered, not quite under their breath. 17 grand down the toilet. Another voice chimed in. Could have bought a decent car. Hell, could have bought 2 decent cars. Mara signed the papers with a hand that trembled only slightly. Her signature a defiant slash of blue ink across the bottom of the deed. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and lipstick bleeding into the fine lines around her mouth, looked at her with something between pity and fascination. "You sure about this, honey? That place hasn't been touched since 1987. The county's been trying to offload it for years." "I'm sure," Mara said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She folded the deed into her canvas messenger bag, the one with the fraying strap she kept meaning to replace, and walked toward the exit. The laughter followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Before we continue with Mara's story, if you're enjoying this tale of impossible dreams and second chances, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, back to Mara and her condemned hospital. Outside, October had painted Millbrook Falls in shades of amber and rust. The town looked exactly as it had when she was 17 and couldn't wait to escape it. Small, suffocating, wrapped in the kind of nostalgia that conveniently forgot all the ugly parts. Main Street still had the same 5 blocks of brick storefronts. The same diner where farmers gathered at 5 in the morning to complain about crop prices and property taxes. The same pharmacy where old Mr. Henderson still mixed prescriptions by hand and knew everyone's business before they did. Mara's sedan was parked 2 blocks down, and she walked toward it with her head up, even though she could feel eyes tracking her from every window she passed. Millbrook Falls had a way of making you feel simultaneously invisible and overexposed, like living inside a fishbowl where everyone was watching but no one really saw you. She'd forgotten that particular suffocation, or maybe she'd just convinced herself she had. Her phone buzzed as she slid behind the wheel. A text from her sister, Claire, 3 states away in a life that made sense. "Please tell me you didn't actually do it." Mara typed back, "Keys are mine. I'm heading there now." The response came immediately, "You're insane. Call me when you realize what a mistake this is." She silenced her phone and started the engine. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of town, where Millbrook Falls bled into farmland and forgotten places. Mara remembered it from childhood, back when it still hummed with life. The ambulance sirens at odd hours, the way her mother would drop her voice to a whisper whenever they drove past it, as if the building itself demanded reverence. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital had been the beating heart of the county once, the place where babies drew their first breath and the elderly drew their last, where miracles and tragedies wore the same white coats and walked the same fluorescent-lit halls. Then came December 1987. Mara had been 6 years old when the hospital closed. Too young to understand the whispered conversations, the way adults' voices dropped when they spoke of it. She remembered her mother crying at the kitchen table, her father saying "those poor souls" over and over like a prayer that couldn't find its way to heaven. The official story was a basement collapse. 3 people dead. But even as a child, Mara had sensed there was more to it, something the grown-ups weren't saying. The hospital had stood empty ever since. 38 years of becoming exactly the kind of place people warned their children away from, where ghost stories grew like mold in dark corners. And now it was hers. The iron gates hung open on rusted hinges, one dragging in the gravel like a broken wing. Mara turned down the long driveway, her tires crunching over weeds that had buckled the asphalt into waves and ridges. Trees had grown wild here, their branches reaching across the drive to form a tunnel of shadow and filtered light. It felt like driving into another world, or perhaps into the throat of the past itself. Then the building emerged from the trees, and Mara's breath caught despite herself. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital rose 4 stories into the October sky, its red brick facade darkened by decades of rain and soot. The architecture belonged to another era, 1920s, maybe earlier, all Gothic revival elegance gone to seed. Arched windows, most of them broken now, gaped like empty eye sockets. The main entrance, once grand with its carved stone archway and double doors, sagged under the weight of time. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall, climbing all the way to the roofline where stone angels stood watch, their faces eroded by weather into smooth, featureless masks. It should have been terrifying. Everyone in town certainly thought so. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, Mara felt something else entirely. A pull, deep in her chest, like a hand reaching through water. Recognition, maybe, or something older than recognition. The building seemed to lean toward her, waiting. She killed the engine and sat for a moment in the settling silence. The deed in her bag felt suddenly heavy, loaded with the weight of a decision she couldn't unmake. $17,000. Every penny of her savings from 3 years working double shifts at the hospital in Riverside. Every cent she'd scraped together dreaming of a fresh start, of building something that mattered. Her friends had tried to talk her out of it. Claire had threatened to stage an intervention. Her mother, speaking to her for the first time in 2 years, had called it another one of your impulsive disasters waiting to happen. Maybe they were right. Probably they were right. But Mara had learned that the worst mistakes of her life had come from listening to other people's certainty instead of her own gut. She'd already played it safe once. Married the right man, took the sensible job, swallowed her dreams like bitter medicine because that's what responsible adults did. Look where that had gotten her. Divorced at 32, living in a studio apartment with walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television through the drywall. Working herself into exhaustion for a paycheck that barely covered rent and student loans. So maybe insanity was exactly what she needed. Maybe the only way to build a new life was to start with something everyone else had given up on. Mara grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. The October air bit at her face, sharp with the smell of decay and damp leaves. She approached the main entrance, her boots loud against the cracked concrete steps. The double doors hung partially open, one suspended at an angle by a single hinge. She pushed through carefully, with groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The lobby took her breath away. Even through the ruin, she could see what it must have been. The floor was a checkerboard of black and white marble, cracked now and littered with debris. Chunks of fallen plaster, dead leaves, the twisted skeleton of what might have been a light fixture. The reception desk curved along the left wall, its wooden surface warped and water-stained but still elegant in its bones. A grand staircase swept upward to the second floor, its carved banister missing sections like a smile with broken teeth. And above it all, 3 stories up, a stained glass dome let in pools of colored light, crimson and sapphire and gold, painting the destruction below in shades of unexpected beauty. Mara stood in the center of that broken beauty and felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, though she probably should have been afraid. Not even the practical dread of realizing she'd bought a money pit that would devour years of her life. Instead, she felt a strange, fierce joy, the kind that comes from standing at the edge of something impossible and deciding to jump anyway. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph, the dying light catching in the stained glass overhead. Then another, and another. Each click of the camera felt like a promise, like the first words of a story she was only beginning to understand. The sound of footsteps behind her made her spin around, heart hammering. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun, so she couldn't see his face clearly. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work boots and canvas jacket. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Building's not safe," he said finally, his voice carrying across the empty lobby. "Not hostile, but not exactly friendly either. You shouldn't be in here alone." Mara squared her shoulders. "I own it. As of about 45 minutes ago." The man stepped forward into the colored light, and she could see him properly now. Maybe 40, with the kind of weathered face that came from working outdoors, dark hair shot through with gray at the temples. His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between skepticism and something that might have been respected. "You're the one who bought this place." Not a question. "The whole town's talking about it." "Let me guess. They think I'm crazy." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Among other things." He extended a hand. "Marcus Chen. I run a restoration company out of Havenport. I used to do some work around here, back before I knew better." She shook his hand, noting the calluses, the firm grip. "Mara Whitfield. And I probably am crazy, but I'm also determined." Marcus looked around the lobby, his gaze traveling up to the stained glass dome, across the ruined grandeur. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his expression. "You know what happened here, right? In '87. I know 3 people died. I know the county condemned it. You know what happened here, right? In '87. 3 people died. The county condemned it." Marcus nodded slowly, still studying her face like he was trying to solve an equation. "That's the official story. But you should know, Ms. Whitfield, there are about a dozen other stories floating around this town about why St. Catherine's really closed. Most of them don't involve structural failure." The colored light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, and the lobby darkened by degrees. Somewhere in the building, something creaked, metal or wood, settling or shifting. Mara felt the hair rise on her arms, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't believe in ghost stories." "Good," Marcus said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Because if you're serious about this place, you're going to need to believe in something a lot more concrete. Permits, inspections, structural assessments. The county won't let you do anything here without jumping through every bureaucratic hoop they've got. And that's if they let you do anything at all. They sold it to me. That means they believe it's salvageable. Or it means they wanted someone else's problem off their books." He pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. "Look, I'm not trying to discourage you. God knows this place deserves a second chance. But you need to go into this with your eyes open. I've seen a lot of historic renovations. This one's going to be different." Mara took the card. "Marcus Chen, Chen Restoration and Preservation. Phone number and email in clean, professional font." "Different how?" Marcus looked up at the stained glass dome again, and in profile his expression was almost sad. "Different because everyone's going to fight you. The town council, the preservation board, the insurance companies. Different because this building's been standing empty so long, people have forgotten how to imagine it any other way. Different because you're trying to bring back something people would rather keep buried." "Then why give me your card?" He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw genuine warmth there. "Because someone who walks into a place like this and sees possibility instead of ruin, that's someone worth helping, even if you are completely out of your mind." Mara laughed, surprising herself. The sound echoed through the empty lobby, bouncing off marble and water-damaged plaster, and for a moment it felt like the building was laughing with her. "You know what? I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one." Marcus headed back toward the entrance, then paused. "One more thing. Be careful walking around here. The 3rd floor's completely unstable, and I'd stay out of the basement altogether. Whatever you do, don't go down there alone." "Why not?" He was already halfway through the door, but his voice carried back to her, quiet and serious. "Because that's where it happened, and some places remember their tragedies longer than people do." Then he was gone, and Mara was alone in the gathering darkness, standing in pools of colored light that seemed to pulse with their own faint heartbeat. The building settled around her, groaning, shifting, breathing. She should have been frightened. Instead, she felt something clicking into place, like a key finding its lock. She pulled out her phone and called Claire, who answered on the first ring with an exasperated, "Please tell me you're calling from a hotel. I'm standing in the lobby." "Claire, you should see this place. It's incredible." A long silence. Then, "Mars, please, come home. This isn't the adventure you think it is." Mara turned in a slow circle, taking in the broken beauty surrounding her. The marble floors, the grand staircase, the colored light filtering down through decades of dust and neglect. "I am home," she said softly. "I just didn't know it until now." She hung up before Claire could argue, silenced her phone, and stood alone in the dying light. Above her, the stained glass dome glowed like a promise. Around her, the hospital waited, and somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she'd forgotten existed, Mara Whitfield felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, impossible hope. She smiled in the darkness and whispered to the empty air, "Okay, St. Catherine's. Let's see what you're hiding." The building groaned in response, and somewhere far below, in depths she couldn't yet imagine, something ancient and patient stirred awake. The first night, Mara slept in her car. Not because she couldn't afford a motel, though the Millbrook Inn's rates were suspiciously high for a town this size, but because she couldn't bear to leave. She'd parked in the circular drive near the main entrance, locked the doors, and reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go. Through the windshield, she could see the hospital's silhouette against the star-scattered sky, its broken windows like dark mouths whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. She woke at dawn to someone rapping hard on her window. Sheriff Tom Breslin stood there in full uniform, his face carved from the same disapproval her father used to wear like a second skin. Mara rolled down the window, blinking sleep from her eyes, tasting the stale coffee she'd drunk at midnight. "Ms. Whitfield, this is private property." "I know. It's mine." Breslin's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. He was younger than she remembered, maybe 50, but carried himself with the rigid authority of someone who'd never questioned whether he deserved it. "You can't stay here overnight. Town ordinance prohibits camping on commercial property." Mara sat up straighter, ignoring the crick in her neck. "It's not commercial property. It's residential. I live here. You can't live in a condemned building." "I'm not living in it. I'm living at it. There's a difference." They stared at each other through the open window, and Mara could see him calculating, trying to find the regulation that would give him authority over her stubbornness. Finally, he stepped back. "The town council's calling an emergency meeting about this place. Tuesday night, 7 o'clock. You'll want to be there. Will I have a choice?" His smile was thin as paper. "In Millbrook Falls, Ms. Whitfield, you always have a choice. It's just that some choices come with consequences." He tapped the roof of her car twice, a dismissal, and walked back to his cruiser. Mara watched him drive away, then pulled out her phone. 17 missed calls from Claire. 12 text messages. 3 voicemails she didn't have the energy to listen to. She silenced the notifications and pocketed the phone. The morning was cold and brilliant, October sun pouring honey-colored light across everything it touched. Mara grabbed her backpack. Spare clothes, toiletries, the remnants of yesterday's gas station dinner, and approached the hospital like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. In daylight, the building revealed details the darkness had hidden. The stone angels weren't just weathered. They'd been deliberately defaced, their wings chiseled away, leaving only jagged stumps. Graffiti scarred the lower walls. Teenagers' names, crude symbols, a spray-painted warning that read "Stay out" in letters 2 feet tall. Someone had tried very hard to make this place uninviting. The question was why. Inside, the lobby looked different in the morning light. Less romantic, more brutally honest about its decay. Water damage bloomed across the walls in shapes like continents on an undiscovered map. The marble floor, which had seemed merely cracked yesterday, revealed itself to be a minefield of missing tiles and holes that dropped into darkness below. The grand staircase, magnificent from a distance, showed rot in its treads, wood gone soft and treacherous. Mara pulled out a notebook and began documenting everything. She'd worked as a nurse long enough to understand triage, to know you had to assess the full scope of damage before you could begin healing. She moved through the first floor methodically, taking photographs, making notes, her breath visible in the cold air. The emergency room still had gurneys pushed against the walls, their wheels rusted solid, their vinyl surfaces cracked and peeling. Medical equipment sat exactly where it had been abandoned. Outdated monitors with dead screens, for stands tilted at drunken angles, a crash cart with its drawers hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Someone had stripped the place of anything valuable decades ago, but they'd left the bones behind, and the bones told stories. She found children's drawings still pinned to a bulletin board in what must have been the pediatric ward. Crayon pictures of stick-figure families and smiling sons. The paper yellowed and brittle, edges curling with age. One drawing showed a hospital with red crosses on the windows and a child standing outside, arms raised like they were waiting to be picked up. At the bottom, in careful block letters, "Get well soon, Mama." Mara's throat tightened. She left the drawing where it was. Some memories deserved to stay undisturbed and moved on. The cafeteria was a cathedral of abandonment. Long tables still stood in neat rows, chairs tucked underneath as if waiting for a lunch rush that would never come. The serving line stretched along one wall, stainless steel dulled to gray, the menu board above it still displaying prices from 1987. Meatloaf $2.50, coffee 35 cents, PIE $1. Mara stood behind the counter and imagined the workers who'd stood here, serving food to doctors and nurses and anxious families. Ordinary people doing ordinary work, never knowing their Tuesday would become the last Tuesday this place ever saw. She found the first sign of something wrong in the administrative offices on the second floor. The door to the records room hung open, and inside was chaos. Filing cabinets toppled and emptied, their contents scattered across the floor in a blizzard of paper. Patient files, personnel records, billing statements, 38 years of medical history torn apart and left to rot. Mara knelt and picked up a file at random. The paper disintegrated at her touch. Ink bled into illegibility by water and time. But it wasn't water damage that had destroyed this room. The filing cabinets hadn't fallen. They'd been pushed. The shelves weren't collapsed from age. They'd been torn from the walls. Someone had ransacked this place, and not recently. The dust lay thick and undisturbed, suggesting the destruction had happened years ago, maybe even before the hospital closed. Mara sat back on her heels, pulse quickening. What had someone been looking for? And had they found it? She spent the rest of the morning exploring, and with each room, the mystery deepened. The pharmacy had been stripped bare. Not unusual, drugs had value. But the violent way the cabinets had been pried open suggested desperation rather than opportunistic theft. The morgue in the basement, which she entered despite Marcus's warning, stood eerily intact, its steel drawers still closed, its examination table bolted to the floor. But the far wall showed signs of construction, fresh even after decades. Concrete that didn't match the rest of the foundation, bricks of a slightly different shade, as if someone had sealed off a section of the basement and tried to make it look original. Mara stood in that cold, dark space and felt the weight of the building pressing down on her. Not threatening exactly, more like testing, the way you might test ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. Her phone rang, the sound obscene in the silence. She scrambled for it, heart hammering, and saw her mother's name on the screen. She almost didn't answer. The last time they'd spoken, her mother had said things that couldn't be unsaid, words that had carved trenches between them too wide to cross. But something made her answer. Maybe loneliness. Maybe the simple human need to hear a familiar voice in an unfamiliar place. Mom! Mara! Her mother's voice came through thin and strained. I heard what you did. The hospital. News travels fast. This town is 5,000 people. Everything travels fast. A pause, heavy with things neither of them wanted to say. Why, Mara? Of all the foolish, self-destructive things you could do, why this? Mara closed her eyes. Because I needed to do something that mattered. Something that was mine. You could have done that anywhere. You didn't have to come back here. You didn't have to buy the one place in this entire town that everyone wants to forget. Maybe that's exactly why I bought it. Her mother made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. You're so much like your father. He was always trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed, save things that didn't want to be saved. Do you know where that got him? Mara did know. She'd been 14 when her father had his first heart attack, 16 when he had his second. She'd been holding his hand when the third one killed him, feeling his grip weaken and slip away like water through her fingers. The doctors said it was genetics, lifestyle, stress. Her mother said it was the town, the endless weight of other people's expectations and disappointments. "This isn't about Dad," Mara said quietly. "Isn't it? You think I don't see what you're doing? You think buying that cursed place is going to somehow prove something, redeem something? Mara, there's nothing in that hospital but bad memories and worse luck. Let it go. Come home. Real home, not that death trap." "I can't. Can't or won't. Does it matter?" The silence stretched between them, 300 miles and 30 years of misunderstandings. Finally, her mother said, "When you fail, and you will fail, Mara, because that place is built on tragedy. Don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces. I can't watch you destroy yourself again." The line went dead before Mara could respond. She stood in the morgue, phone clutched in her hand, and felt the old familiar ache blooming in her chest. Her mother was wrong about many things, but maybe not about this. Maybe some places really were beyond saving. Maybe some daughters really were beyond redemption. She was still standing there, lost in dark thoughts, when she heard footsteps above her. Mara froze. The footsteps weren't furtive or hesitant. They moved with purpose, steady and deliberate, crossing the floor directly above her head. She'd locked the main entrance behind her. The windows were too high to climb through without a ladder, which meant either someone had been inside all along, or they'd found another way in. Her first instinct was to call out, announce herself. Her second instinct, the one shaped by too many late-night shifts in understaffed emergency rooms, too many encounters with people whose desperation had curdled into violence, was to stay quiet and find a way out. She chose the second instinct. Moving as silently as she could, Mara crossed to the morgue entrance and peered into the hallway. The basement stretched in both directions, lit only by thin light filtering through ground-level windows thick with grime. The footsteps had stopped. In the silence, she could hear her own heartbeat, feel it pulsing in her throat. Then a voice, male, calling down the stairs. "Hello? Anyone down there?" Not threatening, actually apologetic. Mara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and called back, "Yes, coming up." She climbed the stairs to find a man in his 60s waiting in the lobby, looking sheepish. He wore coveralls and work boots, carried a toolbox, and had the kind of weathered kindness in his face that comes from a lifetime of hard work honestly done. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "I'm Joe Briggs, county inspector. I'm supposed to do a walkthrough. Make sure the place is safe for occupancy before you start any work." Mara shook his hand, still catching her breath. "Mara Whitfield. I didn't know anyone was coming today." "They didn't tell you?" Joe looked annoyed, though not at her. "Typical. The county clerk was supposed to call you yesterday. Guess she forgot, or didn't bother. Hard to say which is around here." They spent the next 3 hours going through the building together, Joe making notes on a clipboard, taking measurements, testing beams and floors with a professional skeptical eye. He moved like someone who knew buildings intimately, could read their secrets in the way a board flexed or a wall leaned. Watching him work, Mara felt both reassured and terrified. Reassured because he clearly knew what he was doing, terrified because she could see the growing concern in his expression. Finally, in the 4th-floor hallway, Joe stopped and turned to her. His face was kind but serious. "Ms. Whitfield, I'm going to be straight with you. This building needs about $200,000 in immediate structural work before it's even close to safe. The foundation's compromised, probably from that collapse in '87. The roof's got 3, maybe 4 more years before it fails completely. The electrical system is a fire hazard, the plumbing's shot, and I found asbestos in at least 6 rooms. That's not including the cosmetic work, the HVAC, the windows, or any of the historical preservation requirements the town's going to hit you with." Mara felt the floor tilting under her feet, though she knew it was just her body responding to information her mind didn't want to accept. 200,000. At minimum. Could be more once you get into the walls. Joe looked at her with genuine sympathy. "I don't mean to crush your dreams here, but you need to know what you're up against. This isn't a renovation project. It's a rescue operation. What if I do the work myself? Some of it, anyway. You a licensed contractor? I'm a nurse, but I'm good with my hands, and I learn fast. Joe smiled sadly. Ms. Whitfield, there isn't a bank in this county that'll give you an occupancy permit without licensed professionals doing the work. And that's if you can even get the permits in the first place, which I'm betting the town's going to fight you on every step of the way. Why? The word came out harsher than she meant it. Why does everyone in this town want this place to stay abandoned? What are they so afraid of? Joe looked around the hallway, at the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. You really don't know, do you? About what happened here before the official story. I know 3 people died. I'm not talking about the collapse. Joe set his toolbox down and leaned against the wall, like a man settling in to tell a story he didn't want to tell. In 1986, a year before St. Catherine's closed, there was a doctor here, Dr. Richard Thorne. The young guy, brilliant, came from one of those fancy schools back east. He specialized in psychiatric care, ran a program for patients dealing with severe trauma, PTSD, things like that. Real cutting-edge stuff for the time. Mara felt a chill creep up her spine despite the warmth of the afternoon. What happened to him? Depends who you ask. The official story is he left town suddenly, some kind of family emergency. Unofficial story. Joe paused, choosing his words carefully. Unofficial story is that his patients started getting worse instead of better. Started having episodes, seeing things that weren't there. 3 of them tried to kill themselves in the same week. 1 succeeded. That's horrible. But, and then there's the basement, Joe continued as if she hadn't spoken. The section that collapsed? That's where Thorne did his work. Private treatment rooms, observation areas, places where he could work with patients away from the regular hospital staff. After he left and the basement collapsed, the county sealed it off without ever doing a proper investigation. Said it was too dangerous, too expensive to excavate. But my dad worked construction, helped pour that concrete wall you probably saw down there. He said they weren't sealing off a collapse. They were sealing off rooms that were still intact. Mara's mouth had gone dry. Why would they do that? Joe picked up his toolbox, ready to leave, but he met her eyes with absolute seriousness. Because sometimes, Ms. Whitfield, it's easier to bury a problem than to face it. This town buried whatever happened in those rooms, and they've been trying to forget about it ever since. You buying this place means they might have to remember. That's why they're afraid. He left her with a promise to file his report by Friday and advice to seriously reconsider what she was doing. Mara stood in the empty hallway, Joe's words echoing in her head, and felt the building shift around her. Not physically, nothing so obvious, but something deeper, like the hospital itself was breathing, waking up, paying attention now that someone had spoken its secrets aloud. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, the only place in the building that felt almost peaceful. Someone had loved books here. The shelves still held volumes of medical texts, novels, magazines, all slowly disintegrating into dust and memory, but arranged with such obvious care that Mara could picture the librarian who tended them. There was a reading nook by the window where afternoon light pooled like honey, and Mara sat there with her notebook, trying to make sense of numbers that wouldn't add up. $200,000. She'd need investors, loans, grants. She'd need miracles. She'd need to convince a town that wanted nothing to do with this place that it deserved to exist again. The sun was setting when Marcus Chen appeared in the doorway, looking unsurprised to find her there. Heard you met Joe Briggs today, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Also heard you're still here, which means either you're braver than I thought or you didn't actually listen to anything he said. Probably both, Mara admitted. You come all this way just to tell me I'm an idiot? No. I came to bring you this. He held up a thermos and a paper bag. Coffee and sandwiches. Figured you probably forgot to eat. He was right. The last thing she'd eaten was a protein bar at dawn. Her stomach chose that moment to growl loud enough that Marcus smiled. He came and sat across from her, set the food between them, and for a few minutes they just ate in companionable silence, the kind that exists between people who both understand what it means to look at a ruined thing and see possibility. Joe told you about Dr. Thorne, Marcus said eventually. Not a question. You knew. Everyone over 40 in this town knows. They just don't talk about it. Bad for tourism, bad for property values, bad for the collective delusion that Millbrook Falls is a nice, normal place where nice, normal things happen. Mara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting its warmth seep into her cold fingers. Do you believe it? The stories? Marcus considered the question, looking around the library at the shadows gathering in the corners. I believe something happened here that nobody wants to explain. I believe people are capable of terrible things when they think nobody's watching. And I believe buildings remember. Not like ghosts or hauntings, nothing that simple. But places absorb what happens in them. Violence, suffering, joy, hope. It all soaks into the walls like smoke into fabric. You can paint over it, but it's still there underneath. That's not very reassuring. You want reassurance, talk to your mother. You want the truth, talk to me. He smiled to take the edge off the words. Look, here's what I think. This place is going to fight you. The town's going to fight you. Your own doubt's going to fight you every day. But if you can make it through that, if you can somehow pull off this impossible thing, you won't just be restoring a building. You'll be proving that nothing's beyond redemption. Not places, not people. Not even the parts of ourselves we've given up on. Mara looked at him across the table, this man who'd shown up twice now without being asked, who seemed to understand something essential about what she was trying to do. Why are you helping me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. 20 years ago, I was working on a historic theater in Chicago. Beautiful place, 1920s, Art Deco, the works. But the owner ran out of money halfway through, and the building got sold to developers who wanted to tear it down and put up condos. Couldn't save it. I watched them demolish it over a weekend, reduce 100 years of beauty and history to rubble. I swore then that if I ever got another chance to save something that mattered, I wouldn't let it slip away. He stood, gathered up the trash, and paused at the door. Town council meetings Tuesday. You should probably have a plan before then. Something more concrete than stubborn hope. After he left, Mara sat in the gathering darkness and thought about plans, about money and permits and the mountain of obstacles standing between her and even the smallest success. The smart thing would be to walk away now, cut her losses, admit defeat before she lost anything more than $17,000 and a few days of her life. But Mara had never been very good at smart things. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she'd saved months ago and never called. Brian Vasquez, arts and culture reporter, Riverside Herald. They'd met at a hospital fundraiser, talked for hours about architecture and preservation, and he'd given her his card, said to call if she ever had a story worth telling. She typed out a message. I bought a condemned hospital. Want to write about it? The reply came almost immediately. Are you serious? Call me. They talked for an hour, Mara pacing the library while Brian asked questions, and she answered with an honesty that surprised herself. She told him about the building, about the town's resistance, about Dr. Thorne and sealed rooms and secrets buried in concrete. She told him about wanting to build something that mattered, about second chances and impossible dreams. When she finished, Brian was quiet for a moment. Then, this is a hell of a story, Mara. Human interest, historical mystery, David versus Goliath, all the good stuff. I can probably get this in Sunday's edition, maybe even on the front page of the features section. But you need to understand what you're doing. Once this story goes public, there's no taking it back. You'll be committed. The whole world will be watching to see if you fail. Good, Mara said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Maybe that's exactly what I need. That night, she didn't sleep in her car. She found a patient room on the second floor with a door that's still closed and locked, swept it clean, and laid out her sleeping bag on the floor. Through the broken window, she could hear the October wind moving through the trees, could see stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. She should have been afraid. Alone in an empty hospital with a dark history, no electricity, no heat, nothing but her own stubborn determination keeping the darkness at bay. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Not peace exactly, more like purpose. Like she'd finally found the place where her broken pieces fit together into something whole. Just before she fell asleep, She could have sworn she heard something. Footsteps in the hallway, distant and soft, like someone making rounds on an endless night shift. But when she sat up and looked, the hall was empty, just shadows and moonlight and the quiet breathing of a building learning to trust again. The article ran on Sunday morning, on the front page of the features section, exactly as Brian had promised. Mara saw it first on her phone, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with instant coffee and a granola bar that tasted like cardboard. The headline stretched across the screen in bold letters. Nurse buys condemned hospital. Vows to restore town's forgotten heart. Below it, a photograph she didn't remember Brian taking. Her standing in the lobby beneath the stained glass dome, dust motes caught in colored light, looking up with an expression of such raw hope it almost hurt to see. She read the article 3 times, her coffee going cold in her hands. Brian had written it beautifully, weaving together the hospital's history, her own story, and the larger narrative about small towns letting their heritage crumble into dust. He'd interviewed Marcus, who'd said things about her determination that made her throat tight. He'd even found an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, Marcus's mother, apparently, who remembered being born at St. Catherine's in 1948, who spoke about the hospital with such love and longing that Mara felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The article ended with a quote from Mara herself, words she'd spoken in a moment of exhausted honesty. "Everyone keeps telling me this place is beyond saving, but I've worked in healthcare long enough to know that the most broken things often have the strongest will to survive. St. Catherine's wants to live. I can feel it. All it needs is someone willing to believe in it." By noon, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first call was from Claire, who'd apparently been forwarded the article by no fewer than 7 mutual friends. "Mars, what the hell? You're all over social media. There's a hashtag. Hashtag SaveStCatherines. Do you know what you've done? Told the truth. You've made yourself a public spectacle. Do you have any idea how many people are going to expect you to actually pull this off now?" Mara looked around the cafeteria, at the overturned chairs and water-damaged walls, at the impossible mountain of work stretching out before her. "Good. Maybe public pressure will help me get the permits I need." Claire made a sound of pure frustration. "Or maybe it'll make you a laughingstock when you fail." Jesus, Mara. This isn't one of your impulsive adventures you can walk away from when it gets hard. The whole world is watching now. Then I better not fail. The second call was from her ex-husband, David. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over self-preservation. "Mara." His voice was exactly as she remembered, smooth, reasonable, the tone of someone who always knew better than you did. "I saw the article. That's quite a project you've taken on. What do you want, David? I wanted to make sure you're okay. This seems ambitious, even for you." She could hear the subtext under every word, the familiar pattern of concern that was really criticism, support that was really doubt. It was the same tone he'd used when she'd wanted to go back to school, when she talked about traveling, when she'd done anything that didn't fit into his careful plans for their careful life. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've bought a money pit in the middle of nowhere and convinced yourself it's some kind of grand mission. That's not fine, Mara. That's self-destructive." Something cold and sharp crystallized in her chest. "You know what's self-destructive, David? Spending your whole life playing it safe, doing what everyone expects, being so afraid of failure that you never actually try anything worth failing at. I'd rather go down in flames trying to save something beautiful than spend another decade living a life that doesn't mean anything." She hung up before he could respond, hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt dangerously close to liberation. The third call was from a number she didn't recognize, a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Reeves from the Millbrook Falls Historical Preservation Society. Her voice dripped with the kind of cultivated warmth that masked steel underneath. "Ms. Whitfield, I read the article about your plans for St. Catherine's. How wonderful that someone is finally taking an interest in our town's heritage. I'd love to meet with you to discuss the proper procedures for historical renovation." They arranged to meet Tuesday afternoon, before the town council meeting. Mara hung up with the distinct feeling she'd just agreed to walk into a trap. But there was no backing out now. The calls and messages kept coming all day, reporters wanting interviews, architecture students asking if she needed volunteers, and, most surprisingly, dozens of people who'd once worked at or been treated at St. Catherine's, all sharing their memories. A nurse who'd worked in pediatrics for 30 years and still cried when she talked about closing day. A man who'd been born there in 1975 and had always wanted to see the delivery room where his life began. A woman whose mother had died there in 1984, who said the nurses had held her hand through the worst night of her life and she'd never forgotten their kindness. Each story added another layer of weight, another reason she couldn't fail, another ghost she'd be letting down if she walked away. By evening, Mara felt scraped hollow, emotionally exhausted from the constant barrage of other people's hopes and histories. She turned off her phone and went looking for solitude, climbing the stairs to the 4th floor despite Joe Briggs's warnings about structural integrity. The psychiatric wing was up here. She'd avoided it until now. Something in her resisting the darkness everyone said lived in these halls. But if she was going to restore this place, she needed to face all of it, even the parts that frightened her. The 4th floor felt different from the rest of the hospital. Colder, somehow, though that was probably just psychology. The hallway stretched longer than it should, lined with doors that all stood slightly ajar, as if inviting her to look but warning her not to enter. The walls here bore different graffiti than downstairs. Not teenage bravado but something older, stranger. Symbols she didn't recognize. Words in languages she couldn't read. And one phrase, repeated over and over in different hands. He's still here. Mara's skin prickled, but she pushed forward. The first room she checked had been a standard patient room, now empty except for a rusted bed frame and torn curtains moving in the breeze from a broken window. The second room was the same, but the third room made her stop cold. It was an office, or had been. A desk sat against one wall, its surface buried under papers that had somehow survived the decades. Bookshelves lined the other walls, still full of medical texts and journals. And on the wall behind the desk, a framed diploma. Dr. Richard Thorne, Harvard Medical School, Department of Psychiatry. She'd found his office. After 38 years of abandonment, it sat here like a time capsule waiting. Mara approached the desk slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might break whatever spell had preserved the space. The papers scattered across it looked like patient notes, handwritten, dense with medical terminology she half recognized from her nursing training. But the tone of them was wrong somehow, less clinical than obsessive. She picked one up carefully, squinting at the faded ink. The patient exhibits continued resistance to treatment. Claims to see shadows in peripheral vision. Describes them as watching, always watching. Standard anxiolytics proving ineffective. Will increase dosage and introduce a new therapeutic approach. The key is to break through the barrier between conscious resistance and subconscious acceptance. They must be made to see what they're refusing to acknowledge. Mara set the note down, her hands suddenly cold. She picked up another. Progress notes, session 47. Patient becoming increasingly agitated during visualization exercises. Report sensation of falling through the floor and hands reaching up from beneath. Interesting breakthrough. The trauma is manifesting as spatial distortion, suggesting deep-rooted fear of what lies buried in the mind. Must push deeper. They're so close to understanding. And another. This one dated December 1986, just weeks before the hospital closed. The work continues in the lower chambers. Away from prying eyes, away from those who lack the vision to understand what we're accomplishing here. The patients who truly need help, who carry the deepest wounds, they require methods beyond conventional medicine. The basement rooms provide the isolation necessary for breakthrough treatment. Yesterday, patient M finally stopped screaming. I consider this progress. Mara's stomach turned. She backed away from the desk, suddenly desperate to be out of this room, away from the cold certainty of what she was reading. This wasn't a treatment. This was torture. And the hospital, the building she'd bought, the dream she was trying to save, had been the scene of it. She practically ran down the stairs, her breath coming short and sharp, not stopping until she reached the lobby where evening light still poured through the stained glass dome. She stood there, hands on her knees, trying to calm her racing heart, trying to reconcile the beauty of this space with the horror of what had happened above. If you're invested in Mara's journey and want to see how this story unfolds, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves stories about courage and redemption. Your support means everything. Now let's see what happens next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Marcus. Heard the article went viral. How are you holding up? She typed back. Found Dr. Thorne's office. Marcus, he was torturing people here. The reply came immediately. Don't go back up there alone. I'm coming over. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with Chinese takeout and a serious expression. They sat in the cafeteria while Mara told him everything she'd found, her words tumbling over each other in their urgency to get out. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his untouched food. This changes things, he said finally. How? I mean, I knew something bad happened here. Everyone knew that. But now you have proof. Documentation of abuse, possibly illegal experimentation. Mara, if this gets out, and it will get out because that article made you public property, every lawyer in the state is going to see this place as a liability. The county will probably try to seize it back, claim they didn't disclose the full history. You could lose everything. Mara felt panic rising in her throat. They can't do that. I bought it legally as is. They can try. And even if they don't succeed, this is going to make restoration 10 times harder. Historical societies don't like renovating sites of documented abuse. Permits become nightmares when there's trauma involved. Insurance companies will run screaming. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. God, I wish you hadn't found those notes. So what am I supposed to do? Burn them? Pretend I didn't see? Marcus met her eyes, and she saw the conflict there. The part of him that wanted to protect her warring with the part that knew the truth mattered. No, you can't bury it. But you need to control how it comes out. Talk to a lawyer first. Figure out your legal standing. And for God's sake, don't mention this at the town council meeting tomorrow night. Let them make their arguments without this ammunition. They ate in silence for a while, the weight of the discovery settling between them. Finally, Marcus said, You know what I keep thinking about? Those people. The patients Thorne experimented on. What happened to them after the hospital closed? Did they get help? Or were they just discarded, along with everything else? I don't know. The patient files were destroyed, remember? Someone made sure there wouldn't be any trail. Someone, or multiple people. That kind of cover-up requires conspiracy. Mara thought about the sealed basement, the ransacked records room, the town's collective insistence on forgetting. You think the whole town knew? I think enough people knew. And I think they made a choice to protect their own reputations over the truth. Marcus stood, gathering up the trash. Which is why they're going to fight you so hard. You're not just restoring a building, Mara. You're threatening to uncover secrets people have spent 40 years keeping buried. After Marcus left, Mara lay in her sleeping bag on the second floor and stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. The sensible thing would be to walk away now, before she was in any deeper. But when had she ever done the sensible thing? And more than that, didn't those patients deserve to be remembered? Didn't their suffering deserve to be acknowledged instead of sealed behind concrete and silence? She fell asleep still wrestling with the question and woke to someone pounding on the main entrance. Dawn light filtered gray and thin through the windows. Mara stumbled downstairs, still in sweatpants and the t-shirt she'd slept in, to find Sheriff Breslin standing on the steps with 2 deputies and an expression that promised nothing good. Ms. Whitfield, we need to talk. What's wrong? There's been a complaint. Trespassing, vandalism, disturbing the peace. Multiple residents reported seeing lights moving through the building at odd hours, hearing strange noises. Some are saying you're conducting seances, devil worship, God knows what else. Mara stared at him, trying to process words that didn't make sense. That's insane. I'm living here. Of course there are lights. You don't have an occupancy permit, which means legally, you're trespassing on your own property. Breslin's smile was thin and satisfied. The county's prepared to offer you a deal. Sell the property back to us for what you paid, walk away, and we'll forget about the violations. No, Ms. Whitfield. No, I bought this place legally. I'm not trespassing, I'm not vandalizing, and I'm definitely not conducting devil worship. This is harassment. Breslin's expression hardened. It's a reasonable offer. Given the circumstances, you should take it. What circumstances? The circumstances of you being an outsider who bought a property with a troubled history and is now making a public spectacle of herself. The circumstances of a town council meeting tonight where you're going to face some very difficult questions about your plans. The circumstances of you being alone in an unstable building with no support system and dwindling resources. He leaned in slightly. Take the deal, Ms. Whitfield. Before things get more complicated. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Mara felt anger burning through her exhaustion. Get off my property, Sheriff. Unless you have an actual warrant, you have no business here. Breslin held her gaze for a long moment, then stepped back. You've been warned. What happens next is on you. They left, and Mara stood in the doorway shaking with adrenaline and fury. She called Marcus, told him what had happened. His response was immediate. They're scared. That article put pressure on them to explain why they've let this place rot for 40 years. Now they're trying to shut you down before you become a bigger problem. What do I do? Show up tonight. Tell your story. And don't let them intimidate you. The meeting with Patricia Reeves that afternoon was exactly the ambush Mara had expected. Patricia met her at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory, but one where every patron knew exactly who Mara was and watched their conversation with undisguised interest. Patricia herself was in her 60s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. The Preservation Society is thrilled about your interest in St. Catherine's, she said, spreading papers across the table like a general deploying troops. However, there are considerable regulations regarding historic renovation, especially for buildings of such architectural significance. She proceeded to outline a process so Byzantine, so loaded with fees and requirements and waiting periods that Mara's head spun. Environmental impact studies, structural engineering reports, historical accuracy assessments, architectural review board approvals. Each step costing thousands of dollars and taking months to complete. Of course, we want to support your efforts, Patricia continued, her smile never wavering. But you must understand, we have a responsibility to preserve our town's heritage properly. Rushing into renovation without proper oversight would be irresponsible. Mara understood perfectly. This was death by bureaucracy, a way to strangle her project before it could draw breath. How long would this full approval process take? 18 months to 2 years. Possibly longer if there are complications. I don't have 2 years. I barely have 2 months. Patricia's smile finally faltered, replaced by something colder. Then perhaps you should reconsider your purchase. Not everyone is suited for the demands of historic preservation. There's no shame in admitting you've taken on more than you can handle. I haven't taken on more than I can handle. You're deliberately making this impossible. We're following established protocols. You're protecting whatever secrets are buried in that building. The words were out before Mara could stop them, sharp and accusing. You're afraid of what I might find, what I might expose, and you're using red tape to make sure it stays hidden. Patricia stood, gathering her papers with precise, angry movements. That's quite an accusation, Ms. Whitfield. Be very careful what you say publicly. Slander is a serious offense. She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper only Mara could hear. You're not the first person to think they could save St. Catherine's. There have been others over the years, people with more resources and experience than you. They all failed. Some of them got hurt in the process. I'd hate to see that happen to you. She left, and Mara sat alone at the coffee shop table, surrounded by curious stares, feeling the walls closing in from all sides. The town council meeting was held in the community center, and by the time Mara arrived at 6:45, the parking lot was packed. She'd spent the intervening hours preparing, researching, trying to build a case that might stand against the opposition she knew was coming. Marcus had offered to come with her, but she'd declined. This was her fight, her building, her responsibility. Inside, the community room was standing room only. Mara recognized faces from her childhood. Neighbors, former classmates, people who'd known her parents. Their expressions ranged from curious to hostile, with very little in between. She found a seat in the back and tried to calm her hammering heart. The council consisted of 5 members, arranged behind a long table at the front of the room. Mayor Linda Brennan presided, a formidable woman in her 70s who'd held office for as long as Mara could remember. The others were all cut from similar cloth, established businesspeople, property owners, the kind of civic leaders who measured success by stability and change by its potential to disrupt. The meeting opened with standard business, budget reports, zoning requests, updates on the annual fall festival. Mara barely heard any of it, too focused on controlling her nerves and organizing her thoughts. Finally, nearly an hour in, Mayor Brennan looked up from her notes and spoke the words Mara had been dreading. Now we come to the matter of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital and the concerns raised by various community members regarding Ms. Mara Whitfield's recent purchase and stated intentions for the property. Ms. Whitfield, would you please come forward? Mara stood on legs that felt like water and walked to the front of the room. Every eye followed her. She stood before the council table and waited, refusing to let them see how badly her hands were shaking. Mayor Brennan studied her over reading glasses. Ms. Whitfield, you've created quite a stir in our community. I've received numerous calls and emails expressing both interest and concern about your plans. Perhaps you could clarify your intentions. Mara took a breath and began. She talked about the building's historical significance, its architectural beauty, the memories it held for so many people in the community. She outlined her vision, not a hospital again, that was probably impossible, but a community center, event space, perhaps apartments on the upper floors. Something that could bring life back to the building while honoring its history. She spoke for 10 minutes, using every ounce of passion and conviction she possessed. And when she finished, the room was silent. Then Patricia Reeves stood up from the audience. Mayor Brennan, council members, I appreciate Ms. Whitfield's enthusiasm, but I must point out the considerable obstacles she faces. The building is structurally unsound. The historical preservation requirements alone would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most critically, Ms. Whitfield lacks the expertise, resources, and community support necessary for a project of this magnitude. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone delivering a killing blow. Frankly, allowing this project to proceed would be irresponsible. The building should be demolished before someone gets hurt. Demolished! The word burst from Mara's mouth. You want to destroy it? I want to protect this community, Patricia said smoothly. St. Catherine's has been a blight on our town for 40 years. It's time to let it go. The room erupted in competing voices. Some agreed with Patricia, citing safety concerns and the costs of renovation. Others, fewer, but vocal, spoke in support of preservation, of honoring the town's history. Mara tried to respond, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Mayor Brennan banged her gavel for silence. When the room quieted, she turned to Mara with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Ms. Whitfield, I don't doubt your sincerity, but Ms. Reeves raises valid concerns. Before we can even consider supporting your project, we need assurances, proof of financing, a detailed renovation plan, evidence that you can complete this work safely and legally. I'm working on all of that, and until you have it, we're issuing a stop work order on any renovation activities. You may own the property, but you don't have permission to alter it in any way. Is that understood? Mara felt the floor tilting under her feet. You can't do that. I haven't even started work yet. Then consider this preventative. Mayor Brennan's tone was final. Bring us a comprehensive plan and proof of financing. Until then, the building remains as is. One of the other council members, a man named Robert Hutchins who owned the hardware store, leaned forward. There's another matter we need to address. The fire marshal has expressed concerns about you living in an unoccupied building without proper permits. Ms. Whitfield, you're going to need to find alternative accommodations. That's my home. It's a condemned building. This from Sheriff Breslin, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed. You can't legally live there. As of tonight, you're officially evicted from your own property. The room spun. Mara gripped the table in front of her to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. They couldn't take everything away from her like this. A voice spoke from the audience, loud enough to cut through Mara's spiraling panic. She can stay with me. Everyone turned. Marcus Chen stood near the middle of the room, and next to him, a small elderly woman Mara recognized from the newspaper article. Dorothy Chen, his mother. My son has a guest apartment above his workshop, Dorothy continued, her voice clear and steady despite her age. Ms. Whitfield is welcome to stay there while she organizes her affairs. And before anyone objects, I'd like to remind this council that I was born in St. Catherine's Hospital 77 years ago. That building represents the best of what this town used to be. Caring for its people, investing in the future, believing in something beyond quarterly profits and property values. She looked directly at Mayor Brennan. Shame on all of you for trying to bury that history instead of honoring it. The silence that followed was electric. No one spoke against Dorothy Chen. She was too respected, too deeply rooted in the community's history. Mayor Brennan's expression flickered with irritation, but she nodded curtly. Very well. Ms. Whitfield may reside elsewhere while we review her plans. This meeting is adjourned. The gavel fell, and it sounded like a door slamming shut. Mara stood frozen as people filed out around her, some offering sympathetic looks, others carefully avoiding her eyes. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except a dim, stubborn refusal to give up. Marcus appeared at her elbow. Come on, let's get you out of here. They walked out into the October night, cold and clear and full of stars that didn't care about small-town politics or impossible dreams. Dorothy waited by Marcus's truck, small and fierce as a bird. Thank you, Mara managed. You didn't have to do that. Of course I did. Dorothy took Mara's hand between both of hers, skin like paper but grip surprisingly strong. My husband died in that hospital, Ms. Whitfield. Cancer, 1986. The nurses there held my hand through the worst night of my life. They were angels, every one of them. That building deserves better than to be torn down by people too cowardly to face their own history. They drove to Marcus's property on the edge of town, a sprawling workshop surrounded by lumber and stone, with a small apartment above it that smelled like sawdust and coffee. Dorothy insisted on making tea while Marcus showed Mara the space, one room, really, with a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom. But it was warm and safe and blessedly quiet. Stay as long as you need, Marcus said. No rent, no conditions. Just take a breath. Regroup. After they left, Mara sat on the bed and finally let herself break down. She cried for the first time since buying the hospital, great shuddering sobs that felt like they were tearing something loose inside her chest. She cried for the impossibility of what she'd taken on, for the opposition she faced, for the patients who'd suffered in that building and been forgotten by everyone except the ghosts that haunted its halls. She cried until she was empty, and then she lay in the darkness and stared at the ceiling and refused to give up. Her phone buzzed. A text from Brian Vasquez. Heard about the council meeting. This is bigger than a human interest story now. This is investigative journalism. Send me everything you found about Dr. Thorne. Let's expose what they're trying to hide. Mara stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. This was the moment. Once she shared those documents, once the story went public, there would be no going back. The town would go to war. The legal battles would be vicious. She might lose everything. But those patients deserved to be remembered. The truth deserved to be told. She typed, I'll send you photos of the documents tomorrow. But we need to be careful. There are people in this town who will do anything to keep this buried. Brian's response was immediate. That's exactly why we have to tell it. Mara set down her phone and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she'd photograph Dr. Thorne's documents. Tomorrow, she'd call lawyers and figure out her legal options. Tomorrow, she'd start building the coalition she needed to fight back against the Council and the Preservation Society and everyone who wanted St. Catherine's to stay dead and buried. But tonight, she let herself rest in the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. Marcus and Dorothy had stood with her. Brian was ready to help her tell the truth. And somewhere in the darkness, in the empty halls of a hospital that had been abandoned but never truly forgotten, the building waited for her to come back and finish what she'd started. Mara fell asleep thinking about stained glass domes and colored light, about places that remember and people who refuse to forget, about the thin line between breaking down and breaking through. The war had begun, but she was finally ready to fight it. The photographs of Dr. Thorne's documents went viral within hours of Brian's article hitting the internet. Mara watched it happen from Marcus's workshop apartment, her laptop screen illuminating her face in the pre-dawn darkness. Brian had titled the piece, "The Secrets of St. Catherine's: How a Small Town Buried Decades of Medical Abuse." And the response was immediate and explosive. Within the first hour, it had been shared 3,000 times. By breakfast, national news outlets were picking it up. By noon, Mara's phone was ringing with calls from lawyers, victims' advocates, and reporters from places as far away as Chicago and Boston. The article laid out everything: Dr. Thorne's experimental treatments, the patient notes describing psychological torture masquerading as therapy, the suspicious basement collapse that had conveniently buried the evidence, and the town's coordinated effort to prevent anyone from examining the building too closely. Brian had even tracked down building permits from 1987, showing that the concrete wall sealing the basement had been poured just 3 days after the hospital closed, long before any official investigation could be completed. The comment sections exploded with outrage. Former patients began coming forward with stories they'd kept silent for decades. A woman named Helen Bradshaw, now in her 70s, described being committed to St. Catherine's psychiatric ward in 1986 for postpartum depression and enduring what she called nightmare therapy in the basement rooms, sensory deprivation, forced confrontation with manufactured trauma, psychological breaking techniques that left her with PTSD that lasted the rest of her life. Others followed. A man who'd been treated for PTSD after Vietnam and left the hospital worse than when he'd entered. A teenager who'd been sent there for behavioral problems and emerged traumatized, convinced that something lived in the walls of those basement chambers. Story after story, each one a testament to suffering that had been systematically ignored. And through it all, the town of Millbrook Falls remained conspicuously silent. Mara was reading through the comments, her coffee growing cold beside her, when Marcus knocked on the door. He looked like he hadn't slept, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else, a kind of grim vindication. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing," he said, sinking into the chair across from her. Reporters, mostly, but also town council members doing damage control. Patricia Reeves called 3 times. Sheriff Breslin showed up at my workshop at 6 in the morning, wanting to know if I'd put you up to this. What did you tell him? That the truth doesn't need to be put up to anything. It just needs to be told. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. Mara, this is bigger than we thought. The State Attorney General's office just announced they're opening an investigation into St. Catherine's closure. They want to examine the sealed basement, interview surviving staff members, and review all county records from 1986 to 1988. Mara felt something loosening in her chest, a knot she'd been carrying since the town council meeting began to unravel. That's good, isn't it? That means they can't just sweep this under the rug anymore. It's complicated. Yes, it means the truth will come out. But it also means your building is about to become a crime scene. The AG's office can seize it for the duration of their investigation. You could lose access for months, maybe longer. Before Mara could respond, her phone rang. An unknown number, but something made her answer. "Ms. Whitfield? This is Elena Martinez. I'm an attorney with the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund. I've been following your story, and I'd like to help." They talked for an hour. Elena laid out a strategy: file a restraining order against the town council's stop work order, argue that the building had historical and cultural significance that outweighed the town's concerns, and most importantly, establish Mara not just as an owner but as a custodian of truth, someone attempting to right historical wrongs rather than simply renovate a building. "The public support is overwhelmingly on your side," Elena said. "We can use that, but you need to understand what you're signing up for. This will be a fight. The town has resources, connections, political power. They're going to come at you with everything they have. Let them, Mara said, and meant it. I'm not backing down. After she hung up, Mara sat in the quiet of the apartment and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. This had stopped being about her personal dream somewhere along the way. It had become something larger, a reckoning, a long-delayed accounting of sins committed in the name of medical progress and then buried in the name of reputation. She thought about those patients, the ones whose stories were finally being heard after decades of silence. She thought about Helen Bradshaw and the others brave enough to speak up. And she thought about the ones who couldn't speak anymore, whose voices had been lost to time or trauma or death. Someone had to remember them. Someone had to make sure their suffering meant something. The knock on the door startled her. She opened it to find Dorothy Chun standing there with a cardboard box, her expression serious but kind. I thought you should have these, Dorothy said, setting the box on the table. They belong to my husband. He was on the hospital board in the 1980s before he got sick. He kept files, meeting minutes, financial records, correspondence. I never knew why he saved them all. Maybe he knew someday they'd be needed. Mara's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside were manila folders, meticulously organized and labeled. Board meeting minutes 1984 to 1987, financial audits, personnel complaints, and one folder, thicker than the others, labeled simply, Thorne Investigation Confidential. Dorothy, Mara breathed. Do you know what's in here? I have an idea. My husband tried to blow the whistle on what was happening. He brought evidence to the board, demanding an investigation. They voted him down 4-1. 2 weeks later, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He always wondered if that was a coincidence or something else. Dorothy's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with old grief. He made me promise that if anyone ever tried to find out the truth, I'd give them everything he'd saved. I'm keeping that promise now. After Dorothy left, Mara spread the files across the table and began reading. What she found was more damning than anything she'd imagined. The board had known. They'd all known. Dr. Thorne's experimental treatments had been flagged by multiple nurses and staff members as early as 1985. A nurse named Jennifer Hastings had filed a formal complaint describing patients emerging from basement sessions fundamentally changed, traumatized, dissociated, sometimes catatonic. Another complaint from an orderly named Miguel Santos detailed sounds coming from the basement therapy rooms. Screaming that went on for hours, sounds of impact, patients begging to be let out. The board had received these complaints and systematically dismissed them. The meeting minutes showed their reasoning. Dr. Thorne brought prestige to the hospital, attracted funding, put Millbrook Falls on the map as a center for innovative psychiatric care. Any scandal would damage the hospital's reputation and, by extension, the town's economy. So they buried it. They silenced the complainants, some through intimidation, others through payoffs. Jennifer Hastings had been fired for performance issues 3 months after her complaint. Miguel Santos had been offered a generous severance package on the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement. And when the basement collapsed in December 1987, the board had moved with suspicious speed to seal it, demolish the evidence, and close the hospital before any investigation could probe too deep. The official story about structural failure had been a fabrication. The collapse had been controlled demolition, ordered by the board and carried out by contractors from 2 counties away who wouldn't ask questions. But here was the most chilling detail. The board meeting minutes from December 15, 1987, 3 days after the hospital closed, contained a single line that made Mara's blood run cold. Motion passed unanimously to accept Dr. Thorne's resignation and provide an agreed-upon severance package. All documentation related to the basement treatment program to be sealed under attorney-client privilege. Board members were reminded of their contractual obligations regarding confidentiality. They'd paid Thorne off. Give him money to disappear, to keep quiet about what he'd done in those basement rooms. And they'd bound themselves to silence with legal contracts that ensured none of them would ever tell what they knew. Mara was still processing this when her phone rang again. This time it was someone she didn't expect, Helen Bradshaw, the woman who'd shared her story in the comments section of Brian's article. Ms. Whitfield? I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Mr. Vasquez. I wanted to thank you. Thank me? Mrs. Bradshaw, I haven't done anything. You opened the door. Helen's voice was thick with emotion. For 38 years, I've been carrying what happened in that basement. I told myself it was my fault, that I deserved it somehow, that maybe I'd imagined how bad it was. But reading that article, seeing those documents, I finally understood it wasn't me. I wasn't crazy. It really happened, and it was really wrong. Mara sat down heavily, her throat tight. I'm so sorry for what you went through. Don't be sorry. Be strong. Because they're going to try to stop you now. They're going to try to make you the villain in this story, to paint you as an outsider stirring up trouble. But you need to keep going. For all of us who survived that place. For the ones who didn't. Pause. Ms. Whitfield, I know where Dr. Thorne is. Mara's heart stopped. What? He's in Riverside. It has been for 20 years. Changed his name, works as a consultant for pharmaceutical companies. I've known for a decade but never had the courage to do anything about it. But if you want to confront him, if you want answers, I can tell you where to find him. They talked for another 20 minutes. Helen provided an address, a name. Dr. Richard Thorne had become Richard Stone, a comfortable fiction that let him hide in plain sight. After they hung up, Mara sat staring at the address written on a piece of paper, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her. She could let the Attorney General's investigation handle it. That would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. But she'd stopped making safe choices the moment she bought that hospital. And something in her needed to look this man in the face, to understand how someone could cause so much suffering and then simply walk away. Marcus found her packing an overnight bag an hour later. Where are you going? Riverside. I need to talk to Dr. Thorne. Mara, that's a terrible idea. Let the investigators handle it. He's not going to talk to investigators. He'll lawyer up, claim privilege, hide behind the same walls that protected him for 40 years. But he might talk to me, a woman who bought his old workplace, who's stirring up his past. He might want to explain himself, justify what he did. Marcus studied her face, then sighed. I'm coming with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway. You're not confronting a man who tortured people by yourself. They drove to Riverside in Marcus's truck, the October landscape sliding past in a blur of color and light. Mara used the 3-hour drive to prepare herself, to organize her questions, to steel herself for whatever she might find. She kept thinking about those patient notes, about Helen Bradshaw's story, about all the people whose lives had been shattered in the name of experimental treatment. Riverside was a small city, prosperous and clean, the kind of place where people jogged in the mornings and had farmers markets on Saturdays. Dr. Richard Stone. She couldn't bring herself to think of him as anything but Thorne. Lived in a condo complex on the nice side of town, all modern architecture and landscaped grounds. Mara stood outside his building, her heart hammering, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed the buzzer for his unit. A voice crackled through the speaker. Yes, Dr. Thorne? My name is Mara Whitfield. I bought St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. I need to talk to you. A long silence. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. I found your office. I found your notes. I know what you did in those basement rooms. I know the hospital paid you to disappear. And I know that 38 years later, your victims are still suffering. You owe them answers. Another silence, longer this time. Mara was about to press the buzzer again when the door lock clicked open. The man who opened the door to Unit 412 looked nothing like the monster Mara had built up in her mind. He was in his early 70s, slight and gray-haired, with the kind of face that could have belonged to anyone's grandfather. He wore cardigan and slippers, and his hands shook slightly as he gestured them inside. The condo was meticulously clean, filled with books and medical journals. A life of the mind, carefully constructed, carefully maintained. Thorne, Stone, gestured them to a sofa and sat across from them in an armchair, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. You shouldn't have tortured patients, Mara shot back. Something flickered in his eyes, Pain or anger or perhaps regret? She couldn't tell. Is that what they're saying? That I tortured people. That's what your notes say. That's what your patients say. That's what the evidence shows. Thorne closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. I was trying to help them. You have to understand, those patients, they came to me broken. Traumatized beyond what conventional therapy could touch. I believed I could reach them, heal them, if I could just break through their resistance. The techniques I used were based on legitimate research. Exposure therapy, systematic desensitization, cognitive restructuring. The rest of the night passed in a blur. More investigators arrived. The entire basement was sealed as a crime scene. Reporters caught wind of the discovery, and by morning, the story was everywhere. Bodies found in hospital basement. 40-year cover-up exposed. Mara watched the sun rise over St. Catherine's from Marcus's truck. Too exhausted to cry. Too numb to process what they discovered. Marcus sat beside her in silence, occasionally squeezing her hand, letting her know she wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed. A text from Helen Bradshaw. Thank you for finding them. For giving them names again. For making sure they weren't forgotten. Another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize. You did it. You exposed them. The board members are being arrested. The town can't hide anymore. And finally, one from Brian. This is the biggest story I'll ever write. But more than that, you gave those victims justice. You should be proud. Should she? Mara wasn't sure. She felt gutted, hollowed out by revelation and horror. But underneath the exhaustion and trauma, something else was growing. A fierce, protective love for the building that had kept these secrets, that had waited 38 years for someone to care enough to listen. What happens now? Marcus asked quietly. Mara looked at the hospital, at its broken windows and crumbling walls, at the police tape and investigators and all the machinery of justice finally, belatedly grinding into motion. The state had already announced they'd provide emergency funding for structural stabilization. Elena Martinez was drafting proposals for memorial grants. Dorothy Chen was organizing survivor support groups. The impossible was becoming possible, one phone call, one donation, one volunteer at a time. She thought about the 3 people they'd found. Margaret Rose, Kevin, Teresa, finally being brought into the light after 38 years of darkness. She thought about Helen Bradshaw and all the survivors who could finally speak their truth without shame. She thought about Dr. Thorne sitting in his clean apartment with his dirty secrets, and how the truth had found him anyway. Now, Mara said, turning to Marcus, now we rebuild. Not just the building, everything. The truth, the trust, the community. We turn this place into something that honors what happened here, that makes sure it never happens again. Marcus studied her face in the dawn light. That's going to take years. Millions of dollars. More strength than anyone should have to have. I know. Mara smiled, tired but genuine. Good thing I'm too stubborn to know when to quit. And this time, she squeezed his hand, I won't be doing it alone. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting St. Catherine's in shades of gold and crimson. The building that everyone had wanted to forget, that Mara had bought for $17,000 in a dream, was finally being seen. Not as a haunted ruin or a town embarrassment, but as what it truly was. A witness. A testament. A promise that some truths are too important to stay buried. The stained glass dome caught the morning light, and for just a moment, the hospital looked the way it must have looked in 1920. Full of hope, full of purpose, full of the belief that broken things could be healed. Mara had bought a condemned building and everyone had laughed. But standing here in the dawn, watching justice unfold and history rewrite itself, she knew with absolute certainty. Sometimes the craziest decisions are the ones that matter most. Sometimes the only way to find yourself is to save something everyone else has given up on. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time since she'd signed that deed, Mara Whitfield felt exactly where she needed to be. Standing at the edge of something impossible, ready to build it anyway. St. Catherine had waited 38 years for someone to hear it. Now, finally, the whole world was listening. If this story touched your heart, Please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Share it with someone who needs to hear that nothing is beyond saving. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. And that stubborn, impossible hope changed everything. Not literally, though sometimes, in the quiet moments between tours, she could almost believe the place had a heartbeat. But metaphorically, spiritually, the building lived again. The stained glass dome overhead had been restored to its original glory, each colored panel painstakingly cleaned and repaired by artisans who'd traveled from 3 states away. Light poured through it now, painting the marble floor in pools of crimson and sapphire and gold, exactly as it had done in 1920 when the hospital first opened its doors. The marble itself had been restored too, every crack filled, every missing tile replaced with period-appropriate materials. The grand staircase had been rebuilt from the ground up, its carved banister recreated by a woodworker who'd studied photographs from the hospital's early years. The reception desk curved along the left wall, its surface now gleaming with fresh polish, ready to welcome visitors to what St. Catherine's had become. Not a hospital anymore. Something better, something necessary. Something that honored both the beauty and the brutality of what had happened within these walls. The St. Catherine's Memorial Center for Truth and Healing. Museum. Memorial. Community space. Archive. A place dedicated to telling the stories that had been buried for too long, to honoring the victims who'd suffered in silence, and to ensuring that history never forgot what could happen when power went unchecked and truth went unspoken. Mara walked through the lobby, her footsteps echoing on marble that had witnessed so much. Births and deaths, hope and tragedy, crimes and now, finally, recognition. She'd made this walk thousands of times over the past 3 years, but it still filled her with a wonder that bordered on disbelief. They'd actually done it. Against every odd, every obstacle, every voice that said it was impossible, they'd brought St. Catherine's back to life. The first floor now housed the main exhibition space. Mara moved through it, checking displays she'd helped design, reading plaques she'd helped write. The history of the hospital unfolded along the walls in photographs and artifacts and carefully researched narrative. The early years, when St. Catherine's had been a beacon of hope for the county. The middle years, when it had grown and thrived and saved countless lives. And then the dark years, the ones this memorial existed to remember. One entire wing was dedicated to Dr. Richard Thorne's victims. Mara paused before a wall of photographs, faces recovered from archives, from family albums, from the persistent detective work of volunteers who'd spent months tracking down every patient who'd passed through Thorne's program. 27 names, 27 faces, 27 lives forever altered by what had happened in the basement rooms below. 3 of those faces had special places of honor. Patient M, Margaret Rose Chun. They'd learned after months of forensic investigation. Patient K, Kevin Matthews. Patient T, Teresa Alvarez. The 3 who'd been found sealed in the basement. The 3 who'd never made it out. Their families had been found. Their stories told. Their remains finally given proper burial in a ceremony that had drawn hundreds. Mara had attended all 3 funerals. Had stood in the rain at Margaret Rose's graveside and watched her sister, who'd spent 38 years wondering what had happened to her, finally get closure. Had held hands with Kevin Matthews's daughter, who'd been 5 when her father disappeared and was now in her 40s, finally understanding why he'd never come home. Had listened to Teresa Alvarez's mother, now 93, whisper prayers in Spanish over the daughter she'd thought had abandoned her. The weight of those stories never left Mara. She carried them with her like stones in her pockets, constant reminders of why this work mattered. The basement level had been the hardest decision. After the investigation concluded and the remains were removed, Mara and her team had debated for months about what to do with the space where such terrible things had happened. Some argued for sealing it again, marking it as a tomb. Others suggested demolition, erasing the physical space of trauma. In the end, they'd done something more difficult. They'd preserved it. The basement now served as the most powerful part of the memorial. The rooms where Thorne had conducted his experiments left largely as they'd been found. Visitors descended into those spaces in small, guided groups, walking through the treatment rooms where the walls still bore marks from patients who'd clawed at them, standing in the observation areas where Thorne had watched his subjects break. It was difficult, uncomfortable, essential, because the only way to prevent such horrors from happening again was to ensure people understood exactly what those horrors looked like. Mara climbed to the second floor, where sunlight streamed through newly installed windows, exact replicas of the originals, down to the wavy glass and brass fixtures. This floor housed offices for the various organizations that now called St. Catherine's Home, a victims' advocacy center that provided free counseling and legal support, a historical preservation society that actually believed in preservation rather than erasure, a community healthcare initiative that offered basic medical services to underserved populations. And in the corner office that had once belonged to hospital administrators, Mara had her own space. Director of the Memorial Center, a title she'd never imagined holding, a role she'd grown into over 3 years of impossible work. Her desk was covered with papers, grant applications, event proposals, letters from visitors sharing how the memorial had affected them. But one letter sat on top, arriving just that morning. Mara picked it up, reading it again even though she'd already memorized every word. Dear Ms. Whitfield, my name is Jessica Thorne. You knew my grandfather as Dr. Richard Thorne, though I only recently learned the full truth about his past. I was 17 when he died last year, and I thought I knew him. A quiet, bookish man who loved crossword puzzles and always asked about my schoolwork. 3 years after opening St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital to the public, Mara Whitfield receives a letter that encapsulates everything she's fought to achieve. Jessica Thorne, granddaughter of the deceased Dr. Richard Thorne, whose brutal experimental treatments killed 3 patients and traumatized 24 survivors, writes seeking forgiveness and asking to volunteer at the memorial. After her grandfather's death, Jessica discovered boxes of documents, patient files, unsent letters, journals filled with regrets, that shattered her understanding of the man she'd known. The letter represents a profound transformation. Even the perpetrator's family now recognizes the importance of remembering his victims. The 3 years since the memorial's opening have been transformative for Millbrook Falls, the town that initially fought Mara at every turn, through lawsuits, injunctions, and zoning disputes, has learned to live with its difficult truth. The board members who orchestrated the cover-up have faced justice, though it came late. 2 died before trials began. The others received minimal prison time due to age and health, but their reputations were destroyed forever. Sheriff Breslin resigned, Mayor Brennan lost a special election, and Patricia Reeves fled the town she tried to control. New leadership emerged, understanding that acknowledging dark history was the only path to genuine healing. Marcus Chen has become far more than the contractor who first assessed the building. Over 3 years, their relationship evolved naturally from allies to friends to something deeper, a partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Marcus handled construction and restoration while Mara navigated politics and fundraising. His mother Dorothy became the memorial's most passionate advocate, giving tours and ensuring visitors understood the human cost of institutional silence. Together, the 3 formed the core of something larger than themselves. The memorial now employs 8 full-time staff and dozens of volunteers. Helen Bradshaw, the first survivor to come forward, volunteers 3 days weekly in the Survivors Resource Center. Though the weight of repeatedly telling her story has aged her visibly, there's a peace in her face that wasn't there when she first met Mara. She's become living proof that facing trauma, rather than burying it, opens the door to healing. The 3rd anniversary celebration draws 200 people. Survivors and families, donors and supporters, journalists who've followed the story from the beginning. Brian Vasquez arrives with a camera crew, still documenting what he calls the most important story of his career. Elena Martinez flies in from Washington, where she now works on federal civil rights cases. Joe Briggs, the building inspector whose honest assessment nearly broke Mara's spirit, brings his entire family. And there, clutching a memorial brochure like a lifeline, stands Jessica Thorne. Mara welcomes her with compassion, making clear that she's not responsible for her grandfather's crimes, but offering her a chance to be part of ensuring such atrocities never happen again. Watching Jessica talk with Helen Bradshaw, Mara feels circles closing and wounds beginning to heal. During the program, Mara stands at the podium before photographs of the three victims, Margaret Rose Chun, Kevin Matthews, and Teresa Alvarez, placed on empty front row chairs. Her speech acknowledges her initial impulsiveness and stubbornness, but emphasizes what she learned. She didn't save St. Catherine's, but rather the building saved itself by refusing to let its secrets stay buried. She speaks about how facing difficult history doesn't destroy communities but frees them, how justice even when late still matters, and how a building can be more than bricks and mortar. It can be a witness, a memorial, a promise to do better. The survivors who speak that night do so with stronger voices, as if the memorial itself lends them courage. Dorothy Chen pays tribute to her husband, the board member who tried to expose the truth and was silenced. Marcus talks about how healing a building and healing a community require the same ingredient: willingness to face damage honestly rather than covering it with paint. Near midnight, after most guests have left, Jessica returns from the basement tour with her face streaked with tears, but lighter somehow. Seeing what Mara built from the truth about her grandfather's crimes has helped her understand that his victims deserve to be remembered as people, not case files sealed away. Mara accepts her offer to volunteer, recognizing that redemption means breaking cycles of silence and shame. As Mara and Marcus lock up that night, her phone buzzes with a message from an unknown number. A former patient from 1986 who has never told anyone what happened but, after seeing the memorial's lights and knowing the truth is finally being told, feels ready to share their story. Mara responds immediately that there's always someone ready to listen. 3 years later, survivors are still coming forward. The work is never truly finished. 5 years after opening day, Mara and Marcus marry in St. Catherine's lobby beneath the stained glass dome. It's an intimate ceremony with 60 guests, including Dorothy Chen, Helen Bradshaw as maid of honor, and Claire, Mara's sister who finally understands her. The officiant is a minister experienced with trauma survivors who recognizes the building as a symbol of everything the couple has built together. Since St. Catherine's success, they've become a team, taking on 3 more projects: an abandoned tuberculosis sanatorium in Vermont, a shuttered asylum in Oregon, and a forgotten children's hospital in Pennsylvania, each with its own dark history demanding to be told. Marcus handles restoration while Mara navigates politics and fundraising, proving their model works beyond Millbrook Falls. In their vows, Marcus speaks of Mara's gift for seeing not what broken things are, but what they need to become, courage and grace he needed in his own life. Mara acknowledges how Marcus taught her she didn't have to do impossible things alone, that accepting support wasn't weakness. They promise to continue building impossible things together, founded on truth, patience, and belief that nothing is beyond saving. The reception features speeches from Brian Vasquez, who reflects on how his quirky human interest piece became a story that changed national conversations about historical trauma and institutional accountability. Dorothy Chen speaks of how her husband always said buildings have souls, something she never believed until watching St. Catherine's transformation. How Mara gave the building a voice again and, in doing so, gave voice to everyone silenced within its walls. Claire surprises them with a video compilation of messages from across the country. Survivors who found healing, students inspired to pursue victim advocacy or historical preservation, families who finally got closure. One elderly woman shares how learning about the systematic abuse her brother endured before his 1987 suicide freed her from 35 years of misplaced guilt. Helen Bradshaw gives Mara a small brass key from her psychiatric wardroom at St. Catherine's. Patients weren't supposed to have keys, but Helen found this one hidden in a drawer and carried it secretly through every session with Dr. Thorne, every moment she thought she might not survive. It was her promise that someday she'd be free. Now she gives it to Mara as a reminder that the memorial's work isn't just preserving history but setting people free from the burden of unacknowledged trauma and shame. Alone after the reception, Mara and Marcus walk through the memorial, eventually reaching the roof meditation garden with its clear view of stars. Mara reveals she received an email from a Michigan hospital board wanting them to consult on another abandoned psychiatric facility with troubled history. They saw what happened at St. Catherine's and want help facing their own past. Marcus recognizes what he loves about Mara. She saved one impossible building and immediately started looking for the next one. They agree to take the Michigan project after a honeymoon somewhere with zero historical trauma. There are so many places where terrible things happened and everyone wants to forget. Someone has to remember, has to tell those stories. If not them, who? Before leaving, Mara makes one last stop in the basement, standing before the memorial plaque honoring Margaret Rose Chun, Kevin Matthews, and Teresa Alvarez, with a quote from Flannery O'Connor about how truth doesn't change according to our ability to stomach it. She whispers to them, to whatever part of them might linger, that she kept her promise. She told their story, made sure people knew what happened, made sure they mattered. At their bed and breakfast, lying in darkness with Marcus's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Mara thinks about the future. The Michigan Project and other impossible buildings needing saving. The ongoing work at St. Catherine's. Perhaps children someday who would grow up understanding that the most important work is often the hardest. She thinks about Helen's key, about her $17,000 spent on a building everyone said was worthless, the best investment she ever made. The choice that transformed her from someone running away from a failed life into someone running toward a purpose she never knew she needed. The story concludes with a reflection on what St. Catherine's represents. Proof that redemption is always possible for buildings and people alike, as long as someone is brave enough to believe in it. The memorial will stand for decades, maybe centuries, bearing witness to both terrible and redemptive history. Future generations will walk its halls, learning that the only way through darkness is to face it honestly, courageously, together. Mara Whitfield bought a condemned hospital for $17,000 and everyone laughed. But what she found there, truth, purpose, healing, love, and a future built on ruins of the past, silenced them all. Not with triumph or vindication, but with something more powerful. Proof that redemption was always possible. That belief, passed from person to person, story to story, generation to generation, ensures St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital lives forever. Not as a monument to what had been, but as a promise of what could be. A promise that nothing broken is beyond healing, that no truth is too difficult to tell, that no life is too insignificant to remember. Mara's legacy and St. Catherine's gift is a truth that will echo through time. That hope, stubborn and defiant and unreasonable, is always worth choosing, always worth fighting for, always worth the impossible leap of faith it requires. Her journey began with the simplest act, refusing to walk away from something everyone else abandoned, daring to imagine what it might become if only someone believed in it. And that stubborn, impossible hope changed everything. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Share it with someone who needs to hear that nothing is beyond saving. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.